and proper wages and pensions, and resist the raising of the pension age, and demand public childcare services that would make it possible for women and for men to both achieve this. The money is there, it is just in the wrong hands. Despite receiving benefits in pay and conditions in social welfare acts of the 1970s and 80s in particular, and despite the fact that the European Union asserts that this could not have happened without it, our judgment of the terrible things that came with that package should not be clouded. These include women being forced into further caring roles, the extra cost of privatisation of social services, the loss of our fishing stock and rights, the inability of the state to decide how to handle our oil resources, the loss of control of our currency and public spending, and a loss of freedom in foreign policy. The concentration by the European Central Bank on reducing inflation and using these measures only to set financial policy is a cause of further unemployment. Even the United States uses 3 criteria: investment, employment and inflation when making decisions that take into account the social effects of unemployment. The European Union is an aggressive, militarised military bloc, the largest exporter of armaments in the world. It serves the interests of international corporations and monopolies. It obtains its wealth from workers' increased productivity while impoverishing women. Women who have traditionally opposed war must rally to oppose the increasing militarisation of the European Union, and also to organise to prevent it grabbing the land, water and mineral resources of other countries. We must think beyond the narrow claims of gains in one area and recognise that they are indirectly taken away in another. We need universal collective political action against transnational corporations and monopolies, the people who are directing the EU policies and that are responsible for the disaster that now overtakes the planet.
Next to speak will be Ursula.
Hi. How to follow that? Deirdre has taken a very comprehensive approach to I suppose the last number of decades and how women's rights and women's position has been affected by membership of the EU. I'm going to take a different kind of approach. I want to look at the specific policy developments that have emanated from Europe. And I want to look at the relationship between national policy and European Union policy, specifically in relation to women. So I want to see the extent or the ways in which gender equality has been advanced or has been promoted through a combination of national and European policies, and what the positive outcomes of that have been, and also what the negative outcomes at times have been. And I'm also interested to look briefly at how the current recession, the current economic crisis is impacting on women and the situation of women in this country. So it's that interrelationship between European Union policy and national policy that I'm particularly interested in. Now, I suppose I'm starting from the 70s, as Deirdre was looking at the 70s also. The 70s was marked by membership of the EEC from, in a number of particular ways, but probably the most important was the lifting of the marriage bar. Because no doubt the marriage bar would have gone at some point over maybe to the later part of the 70s or whatever. And there's no doubt that the support and the mobilisation of women during the 70s to support equal rights and equal opportunities for women played an absolutely critical role. But there was no doubt that joining the EEC at the time meant that legally Ireland had to remove the marriage bar at the time. So it was a legal non-negotiable part of the negotiation for membership of the EEC at the time. And it was a particularly important shift for women. For thousands and thousands of women had been forced out of employment when the marriage bar was in place. And it's also true that the government at the time sought to get a derogation from the implementation of the the employment equality legislation and anti-discrimination legislation, and that had to be fought for right through 1974, 1975, until eventually the full legislation was put in place in 1976. So I suppose I would argue that at that point, in terms of equality legislation, that we had a situation in which national policy was being driven by European policy at the time in terms of gender equality through the 70s. Now, that's not in any way to deny or to belittle, and I was myself involved at the time, the importance of mobilisation by women's organisations and other socially progressive organisations at the time. But in terms of national policy, I think at that stage we had a situation in which national policy was being driven by European policy. And in a way, through the 80s, that continued. So, for example, you had the directive on social security, which was particularly important. And again, we ended up in a situation where, in order to get that directive fully implemented in Ireland, a court case had to be taken, and Mary Robinson was the legal practitioner who took the case at the time, in order to get the full equality that directive implied, implemented in practice in Ireland. So that was again an important situation where there was a combination of what was happening at national level and at European level. What I think is interesting, if you go through, if you go into the 1990s, during the mid-1990s and towards the latter part of the 1990s, in terms of equality legislation, Ireland produced at that time the most progressive legislation, the most comprehensive equality legislation across European countries. In particular, that is evidenced not so much in the employment-related legislation, but in the equal status legislation, which created a situation where, at least in the legal terms, there was a situation in which we had anti-discrimination policies that covered the provision of services. And that was not the case in other countries in Europe. And in fact, I would argue that in the 90s, Irish national legislation was driving European legislation. And in fact, Irish legislation was held up as an example of particularly progressive legislation at the time. So, sorry about this. I think that we've looked at a kind of reversal of the situation between 1970s and 1980s into what happened in the 1990s. And I think you have a situation where Irish policy and legislation was, as I say, driving European legislation and policy at the time. And I think that's something that we should, in terms of gender equality and in terms of legislative framework, we should be very pleased with. Not only was it a situation where legislation was extended into the services area, but it was also extended, as we all know, into 9 different grounds of anti-discrimination legislation or protection against discrimination. So that was again something that was in advance of what was happening in most other parts of Europe, including the most cited progressive countries such as Sweden and Denmark. If we look into the 2000s or the 90s, or the 2000s, and the years that have happened since then, there's been a set of particular developments that have taken place that again link national policy and European Union policy. One was the structural funds that under the first, or the 2000 to 2006 National Development Plan in Ireland, which was partially funded by structural funds. About 40% of the funds that were expended under that plan came from Europe, came under structural funds. Now, one of the things that the structural funds had as part of its the criteria in which the structural funds were applied was that any measures that were funded by structural funds in any country in the European Union had to go through a process of gender impact assessment. And that meant that a process had to go through whereby, as well as environmental assessment had to happen under various different measures in terms of gender impact. And one of the interesting things around this is the way in which the Irish government at the time sought to apply these regulations. And what they did was the Cabinet adopted, the Irish Cabinet adopted in 2000 a memorandum for gender impact assessment that would be applied to the structural funds. So the memorandum stated that every policy measure that was to come to, that was to be put through Cabinet from the year 2000 had to be accompanied by a gender impact assessment statement. So they had to put forward a statement, no matter whether it was the Department of Transport or the Department of Labour or it was the Department of the Taoiseach. Everything had to be accompanied by this gender impact statement. And that was in order to ensure that the structural fund expenditure would comply with the regulations that were stated at European level. And that happened. You know, the gender impact statements were accompanied by all the measures that were going through the Cabinet at the time. But there were a number of different issues that threw up in terms of how this situation was applied. The first thing that happened was that a high percentage of the statements that accompanied all the measures that went through simply stated that in this case, the gender impact assessment statement said that in this particular measure or proposal will have no gender impact. That is, it'll be neutral. So they put the statements in, but a large proportion of them stated that there would be no gender impact, or the gender impact would be neutral. Now, that was one thing. So the fact was that they were only paying lip service to a large extent at the time to the gender impact process that they were stated that they were doing, and you know, they were getting through their regulations in Europe through it. But the other thing about it was that they were covered by Cabinet confidentiality. So because they went through Cabinet, and because the measures were, all these measures and these gender impact statements were going through Cabinet, nobody ever saw it. So we never got to challenge whether the gender impact was neutral or there was no gender impact or what the gender impact could be of any particular proposal. So whether it was social welfare developments or whether it was you know, positive developments such as the minimum wage, the statutory minimum wage, which in effect research has shown the statutory minimum wage has been one of the most critical pieces of legal development that has benefited women, although it's not specifically a gender measure, but it has benefited women because women make up the most of those who are on low pay, or the majority of those who are on low pay. So the Cabinet confidentiality meant that nobody knew what was happening with any of these gender impact statements, and 21 years later perhaps we can get to see what they look like when cabinet papers become more available. So we have to wait and see. The other side of the coin was that they were able to report into Brussels that they were carrying out this process, and up to the senior level of government, gender impact was being considered. And I suppose the other point about it is the government assessing itself. So the government was actually, there was no independent voice that was assessing the gender impact of any particular measure. So you had the government assessing itself in secret, and that's effectively how the process worked. And completely absent from the public domain, completely absent from public scrutiny. I suppose another side of what was happening in terms of European policy at the time, or EU policy I should say, rather than European policy, was the adoption of European employment strategy with very specific targets and guidelines. Targets around employment rates, particularly around employment rates, but also about childcare provision. There was the target rates for women's employment was that there would be by 2007 that 60% of women would be in paid employment. The overall employment rate in the state would be that 70% of those between 15 and 65 would be in paid employment, both women and men. So those were the targets that they adopted, and the 60% employment rate for women, Ireland met that target in 2007. In fact, since that, it has slipped back from that target, but primarily because of a rise in unemployment, rather than a change in the pattern of women's accessing employment, but it's because of the rise in unemployment. Now, in the other set of targets, which were there was employment targets, and then there was the Barcelona targets, as they're called, which is about childcare, and that the childcare targets that was set, the specific target that was set in Europe, was that every child under the age of 3, from the age of 3, would have a publicly provided childcare place within the system, and it would be a publicly provided place. Now, Ireland is absolutely nowhere near that situation. In fact, the latest estimation is that only 7% of childcare places for children between 3 and 4 years of age are publicly provided. So we don't have any kind of comprehensive plan. And in fact, if you were to look at the meeting of the Lisbon targets around employment, or the Barcelona targets, the Lisbon targets were met really because of the changes that were happening in our own economy, about the rate of growth, and the rate of growth in employment in particular. It was really because of that process, rather than any particular policies that were introduced by government. And in fact, there were a lot of different reasons and obstacles in terms of government policy that continued to be in place from the perspective of women. From the standpoint of women, I would say the most crucial element in terms of stimulating women's access to paid employment is the provision of childcare. And that was the one area in which the Irish government didn't make any significant moves on. And whatever moves they've made, they're in the process of cutting back at the moment. There were a number of other decisions that were made by government over that period of time, such as a decision that 40% of all representatives on state boards would be women. And again, that was held up in Europe as a progressive move, that is that the Irish government was adopting this position. However, as has been seen in so many other cases, so many other situations, there was nothing set up or established under that guideline of 40% that would create a situation where it would be monitored or enforced. So there was no enforcement system. It was simply a guideline that was out there. And in fact, government ministers themselves didn't apply the guidelines when they were, in many cases, where they were attaching particular policies. The last thing I want to look at is about what needs to happen for gender equality policy to be effective. And I suppose it's the one thing that is certain within the national context is that any kind of gender equality policies, if they are to be effective, have to be matched. There have to be targets, there have to be specific resources allocated to them, and there has to be some kind of line of responsibility within them. There has to be a situation in which there is a strong public voice. There has to be a strong NGO sector that which is independent and that has access to the detail of the policies and the detailed reports or provisions or for example, the kind of gender impact assessment statements that are being put through Cabinet. There has to be they have to be available in the public domain and have to be assessed as such. And I suppose there is the question of gender equality policy in practice. And I think that in practice the recession has had very serious implications for women. Women-headed households face and experience the greatest risk of poverty. For example, 38% of lone parents are at risk of poverty. 24% of older people are at risk of poverty. And those are, in both instances, those sectors are majority women. Majority of those on no pay are women. The gender pay gap is 17%, and the employment rate between women with children and those in the population as a whole is 30%. The budget to gender equality has been cut in half within the last 2 years. There's been a loss of funding to the Equality for Women measure, one of the only positive action measures that have ever been adopted by this government. We have lost the early childhood supplement. Half of it is gone in June of this year and the rest of it goes at December. We've had a loss of funding for the school books programme, a loss of funding to classroom assistants, language assistants, and the traveller programme in education. There's the loss of the Christmas welfare payment. There's a loss of entitlement, direct entitlement to medical cards for the over 70s. There's now the growing threats to child benefit. There's pressure on maternity leave and maternity benefits. And there's been a 43% cut in the budget to the Equality Authority, the loss of the Independent Combat Poverty Agency, 20% of loss to the CUSC, which is the Violence Against Gender-Based Violence organisation, and cuts in community development and childcare programmes. And a quote from Neil Crowley on this one: "Despite 30 years of gender equality legislation, gender continues to be the second highest area of complaint. The issues related to promotion, pregnancy-related discrimination, sexual harassment and equal pay, they reflect an undervaluing of women," which is just one indication as to how the equality legislation, the complaints that are being taken under the equality legislation are the second highest level of complaint is on women. And just in conclusion, I think EU gender equality policies can have a significant positive effect on national policies, particularly where large funding systems are involved and where there are specific criteria established with them. But the importance of strong, independent, national and cross-national lobbying campaigning voices can never be underestimated. And open public access to the policy-making process is critical, and should be reflected in meaningful and resourced consultation processes.
Thanks very much, Ursula. Now, Evelyn is the last of our three speakers.
Good morning. I have a really awful task of following two very expert speakers. I hope, however, that my presentation will be somewhat complementary, because I've taken a slightly different focus in this paper. When I was asked to give this, or to consider a paper by Mary Cullen, a well-known Irish feminist historian, I must say, very flattered. And I also tried to think of, well, what kind of question could I ask? Because I suppose I've been an academic for 40 years, and I've been 40 years writing and talking, in fact more talking than writing, about women's rights. And in particular, I suppose I was a 60s student and a 70s feminist. So I will bear all the hallmarks of my generation. I have not gone into studying on ageing, but I've actually do a lot of work on children now, because I'm also a grandmother. So that means that children and childcare are certainly on my agenda. I thought that the Lisbon issue was quite an interesting one, because one of the interesting facts, I think, about Lisbon and the last Lisbon Treaty vote is that 56% of women voted against the treaty. This often doesn't get much exposure. And for me, I began to ask myself, and in fact, reflecting on my own voting pattern, which is secret but maybe discernible, I asked, why did Irish women, the question I posed really is, why did Irish women fall out of love with Europe? And I did that because I found it rather strange in listening to some of the debates, particularly by very dominant male politicians, who began to remind us of how wonderful Europe had been for Irish women, and had we really forgotten the benefits of Europe, and why were we seriously thinking of voting no to in the Lisbon Treaty. And I began to think really about the nexus connections between gender, our accession and European involvement, and in fact what I unforgivingly call Irish patriarchy, because I am set in that time and place. And when I began to look at this historically, I began to look first of all at the Equal Pay Directive, which my colleagues have expounded on. And I think it is hugely important that the EU was there to actually pick up and to insist upon that directive. I mean, I remember reading a long speech by Colley regretting that equal pay would change the whole demise of womanhood, and probably the kept wife in the home, I'm sure he was thinking of. And I remember, I mean, I couldn't get hands of it, but it's a very interesting piece. It's a bit like the De Valera one, at the Crossroads. So they really, you have to get back, and I find it very difficult to explain this to students who live in a terribly different world. But this was the way it was then. But there's also another side to it, which again I think picks up a lot of Deirdre's paper, is that the equal pay and the infamous Article 119 of the 57 Treaty of Rome, which the French insisted upon, was also a legitimation process for the European endeavour. In fact, it was quite properly called and often referred to as the foundation stone of the social Europe. And we must remember also that when the social Europe was beginning, and when we were talking about the 60s, we were again talking about a terribly different world. We still had live, if you like, socialist countries. We still had the Berlin Wall. There was a very, very different situation out there. We still had, détente between the USA and Russia. This was the situation then. And it's very important, I think, to embed the discussions we had then in that socio-historical context. But I also think the politics of it were interesting, because at that time Ireland was indeed a small agricultural economy dominated by the then enemy of UK, and we really we were hoping through the Lemass era at least and the Whittaker era to attract further direct US investment into Ireland. And of course European membership was the big carrot for US investors because they would have immediate access to European markets. So in terms of the two needs, if you like, of the Irish patriarchy at the time, we wanted accession for European markets to develop industry, and we secondly wanted the Common Agricultural Policy. And the Common Agricultural Policy came with lots of money, and the relation between Ireland and the EU has always been centred on money, and in fact, unbelievably, still is. So the Common Agricultural Policy gave farmers a lot of benefits. We can have another debate about that, but certainly farming incomes and the whole restructuring of farming was dependent on the very extensive Common Agricultural funds that were playing. So I always say that really the equal pay for equal work was got by Irish women because the EU gave our farmers the Common Agricultural Policy and provided the way for US investment in Ireland. That was the deal. Now, of course, one didn't know that they were letting the genie out of the bottle because, of course, that was also the beginning of what is now infamously called the EC Liberal Agenda. Now, normally in Ireland, the expression liberal is opposed to conservative politics. In Ireland, it meant something different. It really meant, for a lot of time, stroppy women, the development and recognition of women's rights really was the liberal agenda. I mean, John Waters probably does it best and still refers to it. And in that scenario, when you look at that scenario, Mary Robinson was the first female president in 1990. My goodness, that was the culmination of a new era for Irish women. It signalled internationally that Irish women's rights had been really accomplished. In fact, it was interesting because it has almost made it totally impossible for anybody who isn't female to become a president of Ireland. But it is also true that men and male workers felt threatened by the liberal agenda, and they were perfectly right to do so. Women are a threat to men, and were a threat to men, and particularly to the dominance of men at that time. And one, I think, of the saddest things in reflection, which is what you do when you get old, is that when you look at now, despite 36 years of EU membership in Ireland, Ireland really, when deep down, has not actually achieved cultural and political equality for women. Again, the Europe that we were going into in the 60s and 70s was, as many have said, a social democratic one. Certainly, as people have mentioned, the labour force of women was very small here. But we were optimistic of what the European Union promised to us. And I think the work of DG5, which was, again, Ursula dwelt on briefly, they really began to expose the very deep patriarchal structures that really restricted Irish women. There was one actually form of legislation that had to get permission from the Minister for Labour to have more than a certain number of women working in factories in Ireland. So, I mean, it was very much embedded, and it did expose those patriarchal structures, and certainly we had some wonderful women, I think, in the political system, and I know there was certainly a terribly extensive women's movement, but I also think that when you're actually getting political change, and in that sense I'm sort of wearing briefly a liberal hat, you actually have to have people who will actually enact policies. And we had Sylvia Meehan, who was awarded for another thing last night, was on every morning in Morning Ireland. I mean, every second morning, at Monday I think at 9, because who else would get out of bed at 9 to actually advance anybody's rights? And there were other people like Nuala Fennell, who was really actually, attacked constantly by radical feminists because she actually wore the liberal hat and actually tried to change the legislation, which she did. in fantastic ways. Monica Byrne, who was isolated for actually bringing up the question of rape in the Dáil and actually putting sexual violence on the agenda. And Maura Gagan Quinn, who was one of the first appointed by Haughey, the chairperson of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Women's Rights, who did fantastic work in those very formative years to actually join up the women's movement with policy change. And it was no surprise really then that when it came to the Lisbon agenda, that we had, of course, surpassed, because Irish women and the structures changed so quickly. Suddenly, we found that women were outperforming men in a lot of indicators, and in fact still are. And when we looked at the Celtic Tiger, now that was the early stages of the Celtic Tiger, because I would be here for much longer talking about the last 10 years of the Celtic Tiger, but certainly the earlier phases of the Celtic Tiger was more properly called Celtic Tigresses, because in fact most of the work in Ireland and most of the increases in the labour force were of women in the labour force, and they were in services, in health and education. In fact, the only area that was not dominated by women particularly was some elements of manufacturing, some of agriculture, and surprise, surprise, the building sector. We will be back to that a little bit later. But the second issue, and the second big treaty, was the Maastricht Treaty, and that is also forgotten about, because of course that was also a hugely gendered process in Ireland. We must remember the Danes had decided to vote against Maastricht, and the Danish women in particular were opposed to it, for the very good reasons, almost like Deirdre would say, that if they were joining the sort of norm of the EU at the time, set rather low and minimally, they would lose out the wonderful, more social democratic system they had, which had things like shorter working weeks, childcare, and all of these things that were part of, if you like, the European ideal. So it was extremely important that Ireland voted for Maastricht, or the whole future of Europe would be lost, we were told. Now, it was really extraordinary, and it's a very difficult one to explain in lectures, but basically, to put it simply, the X case coincided with the Maastricht Treaty. And the people who really were very strongly pro-life had secretly, I think it was Jerry Collins was involved, put in a protocol on the Maastricht Treaty that meant our constitutional position and the defence of the unborn could not be actually affected by this accession. And this was a fear part of the Maastricht Treaty. Unexpectedly, the X case sort of turned entirely everybody's, irrespective of their viewpoint, view of what that would mean in terms of the treaty, the Maastricht Accession Treaty, if passed. And to cut a long story short, basically, in order to pass the Maastricht Treaty, there was, again, one of these strange eruptions of the women's movement. It was actually orchestrated principally by the Council for the Status of Women, and particularly Frances Fitzgerald and Carmel Foley, who worked there, because they actually did a deal. Now, this was before the Now programme that Earth had done, and they basically tried to orchestrate a deal between Irish women and the Irish movement and the state, and said, okay, we will consider voting for Maastricht, provided that we will then subsequently sort out the repercussions of the X case and Maastricht. And that was a major sort of political alignment and movement, which I think was hugely important. They also sought to have more participation, something that's only token now, of women and what they wanted in terms of EU expenditure, because there was the infamous and very good Now programme coming down track. Now, of course, again, this would not have really mattered to, I think, the dominant Irish forces at the time, political forces. But there was £6 billion coming from the structural funds. And if we were to get the structural fund money and the £6 billion, well, then we had to actually agree to vote for the Maastricht Treaty. So it is, I think that was a rather interesting, strange nexus between gender, between the women's movement, and between us, the powers that be, urging women to vote for that treaty. Now, when we come back now and look at the Lisbon Treaty, which is now another another treaty on the agenda, I suppose the Irish government still really almost reeled for a long time about what was it quite that people didn't like about the Lisbon Treaty. I actually don't think, despite the number of consultants and spin doctors and advertisers and communications companies that have actually worked on the Lisbon Treaty and tried to explain why we voted as we did, I actually don't think they've actually answered the question, and I'm wearing my research hat then. I think that one of the things, for instance, 4 expert men in UCD did a study that to me was very reminiscent of the way things were done before the liberation of women. They didn't even have a token woman, I mean, which was really bad. Even Questions and Answers and several radio programs has a token woman. I mean, they haven't still actually male voices equal to women's voices in terms of either media programs, radio or television. But it is interesting that women are so much off the agenda, and so much off the agenda as a political group, that they really actually didn't further suss out why women would be opposed to it. Now, we might also, so I began to think as a 70s woman, if you like, why the EU was not somehow as attractive to me. I actually flicked through all the European Commission reports and found really that, no doubt about it, the European Union has become far more economistic. The social agenda is extremely low on the horizon. And that has come about because we are now in, as you've been listening to over the last day, we are very much, or were then, I think it may be about to change again hopefully, we were very much in the neoliberal market economy, where it was felt that competition policy, and in particularly Europe versus the United States, is very, very central to the kind of workings and deliberations of Europe. The Women's Rights Committee still works, but it's a very tiny stage. Meantime, we would by now have expected in Ireland, us people who wanted to be good Europeans at that time, and women who voted for those treaties, would have expected what Berta Sim had called the second stage of welfare, and which both of my colleagues have referred to. In other words, we got women into the labour force. In fact, we were probably the most, up to the recession, we were probably the most work-orientated labour force, male and female, young and old, migrant and non-migrant, in the whole of Europe until the collapse. And it was interesting when women looked for, because in one sense they went willingly into workplace, they were, as one put it, commodified, they did look for some way of reconciling work and family life. And I don't mean all having coffee one day of the year, courtesy of a big poster I tend to get from various government departments. I mean actually reconciling work and family, because if you took women out of the work, out of home, who was to mind the children? And in Ireland, as both my colleagues have said, this was still seen as the private responsibility of the parents. So, interestingly enough, this was addressed in some lead up to the Lisbon Treaty. And particularly, and before that, there was the whole question of taxation allowances. Because one of the papers I've done in the past is actually showing the way in which the patriarchal system still dominates our taxation system. And this is a very persistent problem on the ground for low-paid women workers, and it's a very persistent problem for couples, particularly lower-income couples who both work. The taxation system of double-income couples, if you like, is the same pretty much as one-income couples, except the one-income couple presumably would be a bit higher if it was a case that there was a choice not to work. And McGreevy and IBEC, on the courtesy of IBEC, this was IBEC was putting this in the last social partnership thing, which again would take another half an hour to unravel, where this was brought up, because this was actually the clinch pin. Both some form of tax allowances for parents who paid childcare to bring childcare into the formal economy, or some public provision of childcare. And while there was some European structural funds came down between 2000 and 2006, otherwise we would not even have the 3% that Ursula referred to, it was part again of an equality measure. And it was very interesting the way the Irish state handled that. They actually, I discovered when I was trying to do research on it, they kind of farmed it off to ADM Limited, a company that orchestrates all this, kept it entirely separate. I presume they're all contract workers, but it was entirely separate, lest it become embedded as an expectation within the Department of Finance and the other actual government departments. It was kept at bay. Of course, it was kept there to get the money again, to have it to spend, but as this lovely little pilot scheme that wasn't going any further. And that was really one of the ways in which I think that certainly women, and increasingly fathers, have lost really any faith in the EU agenda. The EU agenda has to be, and I think as properly explained by Ursula, it's not just out there. We're part of it. Irish policy, and I think it's interesting that certainly to East European countries, pre-transition economies moving into Europe, Ireland and the Irish women's movement and their achievement was in fact offered great hope to Eastern states. It offers still great hope to women in Turkey. So we can't certainly diminish that. But what we're able to tell them is if you're looking for certain rights, well then you must get the full package at a very early stage. Because certainly women at this stage would have now expected the full package. We would have expected, and it's very interesting to go back over that social partnership deal and to have discussions with Roisin Collender and people who were kind of had ears into what was actually and participating in what was happening. But we were sold out. It's a longer story how, but we didn't actually get it. Now we're down to, again, the social Europe. What do we need now, and what is Europe for us? Now, there's no doubt about it that the Europe that the Irish person in the street now sees and experiences is the regulating Europe. Turf cutting, how you cook at home, how you sell food at home, all of those are very much the regulation Europe. And we have lost, actually, Europe itself, the EU itself, has actually lost its attraction increasingly because it has failed to keep up the legitimation process of social Europe, which is extremely important. Now I looked, there are still aspects of social Europe in the Europe, and there is still the European Commission and groups working towards a social Europe. There's no doubt about it. I've got some comfort by the Swedish presidency, which comes in board now, and has actually claimed that 2010 will be the European Year of Combating Poverty and Social Exclusion. Now, the radical amongst you can laugh at that, but at least they have put it on the agenda in some way or other. The Working Time Directive gets very, very little coverage, and that is a huge one. It is a huge one in terms of actually women and careers, who are still part of it, because actually most women in the financial services and men sign away their rights to working hours. They all say we are willing to work more than 40 hours a week. So they have to do so. I mean, there is still work at the European level on those. But they are, I suppose, quite limited. So we go back then to our own needs. What should we be looking for now? What should we be looking for as women, and as with some continuity with the women's movement? Certainly the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights is hugely important, and that will become terribly, terribly important with children's rights. And given the really bad record Ireland has of children's rights, I think that European Convention for Children is going to be probably the most important part of the European Union's social policy in the next 10 to 20 years, because now we're at children's rights, if you like, on the scale of the European Union as a social institution. However, I think we still need to finish the initial 60s agenda. Childcare provision is an obvious one, and certainly child benefits. Remember that one of the first things demanded by the women's movement in Ireland was the payment of children's allowances, which I still tend to call it, to women rather than to men. That was one of the first movements. I think we need to actually say, hands off, certainly children's allowance, and we want childcare. we need, again, I think, another deal. And I would like to see the social agenda, not the whatever political science, narrow bureaucratic agenda, on this Lisbon agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much. They're all fascinating discussions, and I think there does seem to be an awful lot of spin and lip service to around the whole issue of women in the EU. So we've got, I think, 15-20 minutes for questions and